Ahead and get started. Welcome everybody this afternoon. I'm Laura Dillon with MS Dynamics World. Welcome to this month's Portals community call. I'm happy to be joined by Nick Hayduck of Engineered Code. And as we get started, please know that we do welcome your questions. You can feel free to type those in at any time in the questions block, and Nick will be keeping an eye on that as he goes through his presentation. We're also recording today's event, and we'll be making that available as well. So Nick, I'm going to hand it off to you now.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about payment on Power Pages. It's a topic that seems to come up quite a bit, so we're not going to get too technical in terms of like actual code because it really depends on which payment provider you have to work with, but we'll talk about kind of more in general some of the different architectures that can be utilized and which ones are kind of no code, low code, pro code, that sort of thing. So that's what's on tap for today. All right, so just a quick intro. If this is your first time joining the call here, my name is Nicholas Hayduck. I'm the president and a software engineer at Engineered Code Consulting, Inc., based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been working with Power Apps portals, Power Pages, ADX Studio portals, since about 2009, so quite a few years now. If you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, YouTube, that sort of thing, please go ahead if that's what you'd like to do and reach out to me there. That would be great. We do have our weekly videos that we put out, the notifications about community calls. You know, Twitter is a great place. We kind of tweet all the latest updates that we have, that Microsoft is releasing for Power Pages and Power Apps portals. We also got the Refresh the Cache podcast, which we are going to be recording another episode here very shortly. I'm going to be working with George Dubinsky on that, and I'll talk about George Dubinsky in a second because he kind of going to tie him into the presentation today. So, all right. Next slide. Why is this not working here? There we go. All right. As always, just want to thank whether it's Laura or whether it's Jason or basically the entire team at MS Dynamics World for supporting us on these community calls. They're obviously a great resource for news in our community, and really they support a lot of good initiatives. So happy to be working with them on these community calls. So in terms of agenda, we do got a little bit of news that I'll cover this week or this month. Then we'll talk about accepting payments on Power Pages, and then we'll talk about the date and time of the next one. And there'll probably be some time for Q&A. So if you do have any questions, whether it's about today's specific topic or whether it's just kind of Power Pages in general, Power Apps portals, other portal technologies that are built kind of on Dataverse, happy to chat about those. All right, so let's talk about the news. So there was an update to the Power Platform CLI. I like the direction that they're going with this, and that is the ability to include parameters, the include entities and the exclude entities in the PA portal download command. So what this allows you to do is to exclude certain tables from being downloaded when you download the portal. So for example, if you don't want to include site settings, if you don't want to include, I'm dealing with a client right now where they're attempting to get me a big export of their data, and it's things like URL history that's kind of irrelevant. We don't necessarily want to move that between environments. So those commands allow you to do that. This means we're kind of one step closer to what we have with the configuration migration tool, where we have a lot of control. This gives us one more step. Hopefully the next thing that they've got coming down the pipe is the ability to apply, even more filtering by fetch XML, because there's certain times where you don't even want all of one table, you want just certain records of one table, and so fetch XML is a great way to limit that. So hopefully that's coming down the pipe. But at least for now, we do have the ability to include or exclude certain tables in the download command. The other thing is that while it may seem like when the release notes were put out, I think was it back in July, it seems like back in the day they released them and that was kind of it. It seems like those are constantly evolving these days. So I went back and just looked at what has changed since the last time we talked about what was announced in the 2022 Release Wave 2 plan. So they've got a pre-configured the WAF, so the Web Application Firewall. So they've announced that adding the Web Application Firewall to your Power Pages site or to your Power Portal is going to be pretty straightforward. So that's kind of new. They've also announced some data policy governance options for administrators. So this is about kind of defining at a tenant level certain permissions that would apply to, say, all the sites within the tenant. So, for example, restrict access to certain tables. So, for example, if you want to not allow them to expose, say you have some confidential payment table or, that sort of thing, you can say, no, I never want that table to be exposed. Doesn't matter what the person who's building the portal, doesn't matter what they're going to do. I never want that exposed. So you can enforce that, as well as the ability to restrict or enforce certain authentication providers. So if you say, hey, every one of our portals is going to use Azure AD B2C, or everything is going to use Azure AD, or at the very least, none of our portals are going to use, the out-of-the-box Facebook authentication. Those types of things where you can either say you must use this identity provider or you cannot use that identity provider. So some of these more, governance options being made available for administrators. They've also got some functionality to control the visibility of a site. So this is, you may have a Power Pages site up that's currently in development. You don't want the whole world to be able to see it. So you basically say, hey, this thing's not visible unless you log in first. And now this login is separate from the rest of the kind of the login of the portal. There's like an additional layer of security that you must log in with with an account before you can even see the portal. So you log in, you go to the portal, you're still not logged in yet to the portal. You've just kind of bypassed the first level of protection. So it allows you to have a portal that's being worked on, but restricted to only certain people can see it. So that's another great enhancement. Kind of the next level. There was IP address filtering, but it's great to be able to say, hey, I only want these 5 people who know what's going on to be able to kind of access this portal while it's still in development. So it's a great feature as well. As well as I think they're continuing to enhance the experience of developing your Power Pages sites within Visual Studio Code. So that's another thing that's coming out, is they continue to add features like autocomplete or the IntelliSense, that sort of thing. Those things are being added to Visual Studio Code. So kind of an ongoing, I suspect there's always going to be more little enhancements added to the Visual Studio Code integration with Power Pages. All right, not seeing any questions related to our news for the month, so I'll keep moving on and move over to today's topic. So, as I mentioned kind of at the outset here, today's topic is about accepting payment on Power Pages. So before we get too deep into the topic, I did want to kind of give out a shout out to Mr. George Dubinsky, longtime MVP. I don't know, I feel like he's been an MVP for 50 years now. You may know him from either CRM Tip of the Day or CRM Audio. He's done lots of blogs, he does lots of speaking, and he also is, very much into the portal space. In fact, his company Alexis CRM builds a portals product for Dataverse that's built into WordPress. So if for whatever reasons, if Power Pages or Power Apps Portals isn't a fit and you got yourself in the ecosystem of WordPress, he's got a great tool. We've used it on a number of projects. A great tool for building portals built on Dataverse, but instead of it being in a Power Pages site, it's built into WordPress. So you can do things like build forms in Dataverse, expose those forms on a WordPress site, similar to how you can do it on a Power Pages site. You can have authentication based on contact records. you can use what is essentially, it's almost identical to Liquid. In the PHP world, the templating language that's used is called Twig. But I would say it's probably about 98% the same as Liquid. So you can basically write Liquid templates or Twig templates that call fetch XML. So a lot of things you can do in Power Apps portals, you can do in WordPress. So that's what the Alexa CRM product does. That's what his company does. So, and he also does a lot of Power Pages, Power Portals work as well. So he's an expert in all things portals for Dataverse, and working with him to kind of reboot the podcast as well. So looking forward to that. But anyways, so the reason I mentioned him is that we were actually discussing this whole payment thing a couple of weeks ago, and he had a couple of great ideas. He's done payment integrations on Power Pages as well. So I've stolen a few of his concepts or ideas for the call today. So I just want to make sure to call him out and say thank you for letting me steal some of your ideas to share with the rest of the community. And yeah, just appreciate that he allowed me to share some of the things that we're going to talk about today, because some of these have come directly from his brain. All right, so the first thing is, so when we're talking about accepting payment on Power Pages, is that there's no out-of-the-box payment options with Power Pages. With the ADX Studio portal solution, which is now many, many years old, there was kind of a shopping cart functionality, which did include some payment integration. I think there was some PayPal. There was a couple. I think Authorized.net might have also been supported. So there were a few bits and pieces related to payment included in the product. All of that went away when Microsoft acquired the product and released what was then known as Dynamics 365 portals. So there is nothing out of the box for payment on Power Pages. If you are looking to have a portal that accepts payment, you do need to be you basically do need to you have to figure out how to do that yourself. Now, generally, to securely handle payment on a website directly, some sort of server-side code is required to perform the validation. So any solution that you have where you're actually on a website accepting payment, generally there's going to be some server-side code required. And our inability to write server-side code in Power Pages makes this tricky. Now, yes, we've got Liquid. Liquid is server-side code, but it's read-only. So generally, you need to be interacting with the database. And unfortunately, the web API, as great as it is, doesn't kind of relieve of this problem, because the reason that we generally need server-side code is that there are kind of secure API tokens that you don't want visible on in the browser. So the web API just isn't quite good enough to get us around this problem. Now, I will be presenting a kind of a no-code option here, but it is very much kind of an out-of-bound experience where you're kind of redirected, you go somewhere else, you handle the payment, and that can get synchronized back to Dataverse. But it's really not a kind of an on Power Pages experience. It's really just a link off to somewhere else. So it certainly is an option, but the reason that payment with Power Pages is more difficult than people may realize is because we don't have that server-side component to actually properly handle some of the transactions that are necessary in order to handle payment. So again, no out-of-the-box options for payment. So it's something that we're going to have to take on, and our inability to write server-side code is what makes this a particularly fun challenge to solve. This next slide here, so PCI compliance. So I guess I'm going to preface this all with, I am not a lawyer. I am not providing legal advice. All I'm doing is providing some of the experiences that I've run into, and I'll tell you that PCI compliance is something you should always be aware of when you are dealing with any sort of credit cards or accepting payments online. So PCI stands for Payment Card Industry. It's basically a group that includes MasterCard, Visa, American Express, all the major credit card providers. And it's basically a consortium of them saying, hey, here are our rules if you want to accept credit cards online, and here's all the things that you have to do in order to make sure that that happens securely. So PCI has very strict rules about handling payment information. And when we're talking about payment information, generally what we're talking about is like, say, the credit card number, that sort of thing. There are kind of lots of rules about what is considered PCI data, what is not considered PCI. We're not going to get into all those details, but just in general, you probably want absolutely nothing to do with handling in any way of a customer's credit card number. You want to leave that to the professionals that do it on a day-to-day basis and handle all of the PCI compliance headaches for you. The easiest way to be PCI compliant is to not handle credit card numbers at all. Now, to be clear, not handling credit card numbers doesn't mean we can't have a payment solution. You just have to figure out, how do I make that part someone else's problem, and I can kind of handle the parts that don't fall under or don't make the rules for following PCI compliance extremely burdensome. So Dataverse itself is not PCI compliant. You should not be storing credit card numbers at all in any way in Dataverse. Now you can store, say, the last 4 digits of a credit card number. There's certain ways to take data and kind of cleanse it so you can store it in Dataverse, but credit card numbers should not be stored in any way in Dataverse. Now, when we talk about quote unquote storing a credit card, and I remember when I was first getting into PCI compliance, this was probably about 10 years ago, and I saw the word storing credit cards. At first you thought, hey, like I can handle these things as long as I don't save them to a database. But when we talk about storage, we're talking about even temporarily in memory, all that sort of stuff. Like, you want nothing to do with that credit card ever existing in your system. So that means that even if the card is temporary there, if you're not even saving in Dataverse, but say handling that credit card and that credit card number in a plugin, you want no part of that. So that credit card shouldn't even be in memory on any of your servers in order to avoid PCI compliance. If it is even in memory, being handled kind of in a runtime process, that's still considered, that box, whatever that's running on, is required to be PCI compliant. And again, you probably want no part of that. So long story short, PCI compliance, huge pain if you're going to actually start doing that. I've heard rumors of people who have taken Dynamics 365 or Dynamics CRM on premise and making it PCI compliant, but that just sounds terrible. So what I would recommend is stay far, far away from that and let the payment providers handle most of the dirty work for you, and just integrate in one of the ways that we're about to get into. All right, so in terms of accepting payment, so if you're not familiar with kind of how to accept payment online, you don't work directly with MasterCard, you don't go to Visa, you don't have an agreement with them. You go and have a merchant account with these different providers. So they handle kind of working directly with Visa or MasterCard and those types of things. You have your one account and you can kind of figure out, okay, which sorts of payments do I want to enable? So some of the more common or popular payment providers that you may have heard of, Stripe, I think, is probably the biggest one. Bambora, formerly known as Beanstream, is another one that we've used. There's Authorize.net. Another one very popular here in Canada, I know we've done a number of integrations with it, is called Moneris. The thing to understand is each one of these payment providers are going to have different ways to integrate with. They're each going to have their own APIs and their own different kind of architectures to work with them. That being said, there are some similarities between them as well. So I've worked with all 4 of those that I have on the screen, and kind of in general, the basic flows of certain of the products are similar. So we're going to talk here in generalities today. We're not going to say, this is exactly the way it works. We're going to say, okay, with different providers, they might do this thing a little bit differently, but in general, they're all using kind of similar techniques to allow you to accept payment on a website. So the first thing that you kind of have to do is, choose a payment provider. Again, it depends on, your banking relationship. If your bank may offer a certain payment provider, it may have certain integrations. Different payment providers may have different rates. Again, Stripe is probably the most common one. If you just kind of go up, and if you're just some regular person, you go to Stripe and they're going to offer you kind of 2.9% credit card processing. But same time, I know other people who can get 2% from their bank or whatever it is. So Stripe or Bambora or Authorize.net, they're going to have different pricing terms, all that sort of stuff. So that's something you have to look into, but you also have to be aware of kind of what technologies do these things have to offer, and looking at each individual kind of option and understanding how could I possibly integrate this particular provider into my Power Pages site. Like I said, we've done quite a bit with Moneris because here in Canada, it's kind of the most popular one that we run into. They've got a pretty decent API, and we've probably done it at least a dozen times. We've integrated with Moneris in different ways, but we've also done quite a bit with Stripe as well, and I know we've done a couple with Bambora. But I would say if you're kind of not familiar with this space, Stripe is probably the leading contender. It's like I said, probably the most popular one that we've seen, pretty easy to sign up with. So something to take a look at. And they are very kind of e-commerce focused. So lots of cool different options for accepting payment online. So yeah, it's a good option to consider. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually kind of look at 3 primary architectures for integrating payment onto a Power Pages site. And kind of the easiest way to kind of look at them is that there's kind of a low code or a no code way, there's kind of a low code way, and then there's kind of the pro code way. And obviously kind of with the way it works is that with the low code way, or sorry, with the no code way, great, you're not really writing any code, but what you're generally sacrificing is the user experience of the user who's trying to make that payment. And when we talk about user experience when it comes to payment, it often means redirecting the user somewhere else, somewhere off of your portal to have to complete that payment. So the more kind of code you can write, the more integrated within your site the experience becomes. So the first one we're going to look at here is using payment links. So essentially this is a relatively no code option. I know that Stripe has a solution for this, where essentially you can generate a link on your within your say Stripe account. You can put that link on your website, and people, when they want to check out, can click that link and be taken over to Stripe, where they put in all their credit card details. You click submit, and the way that you reconcile that data back with your Power Pages or your Dataverse environment is typically through a webhook. Now, if you're not familiar with webhooks, webhooks are basically kind of a web standard for handling events. And basically what happens is you go into Stripe, you say, here's the URL I want you to call when a certain event happens. So in this case, whenever a payment is successfully received, I want you to post a JSON object to this particular URL. Then what you can do is you can set up a Power Automate Cloudflow, because one of the triggers for Power Automate Cloudflows are basically an HTTP trigger, or it's basically a webhook. So what you can do is you can say, hey Stripe, when you receive a payment, I want you to call my Power Automate flow. It will then pass in the details of here's the transaction that happened, here's how much they paid, it was successful, and then you can use Power Automate to then update Dataverse and say, yes, mark this invoice as paid, in kind of the most classic example. So the user clicks for a link from your site and it goes over to Stripe. Now, generally with these payment pages, you're no longer on your actual Power Pages site, but you can do some branding on them. So it's not going to feel completely like a Stripe page. You can generally pick some logos and colors and that sort of thing, so it's not quite as jarring, but it really, it generally feels like you're on a different site at that point. Branded, but not quite the same site. So you're on your Power Pages site, you have a link that says, click here to pay, you click that link, it takes them to a different site that would probably still have, your logo and your colors, but, then you're filling out the details, you're putting in the credit card. Now, as part of that link, what you can do is you can embed certain parameters. So for example, it could be, the ID of the contact, or if it's an invoice, what the ID of the invoice is, so that you can use that for reconciliation later as part of the webhook. So let's just say you embed the ID of the invoice in there. So when they click the link, they're going over, they're paying that invoice, but you also have the ID of that invoice, so that when the webhook is called that says, yes, I've received a completed payment, you can then reconcile that back with Dataverse. So this is essentially no code. Putting that link onto your Power Pages site is, just a content editor thing. You grab the link from Stripe, you put it on your website. they click the link, and then the kind of the more complicated part is just writing the Power Automate cloud flow that reads in the information that's passed in via the webhook from Stripe, and then you're updating the, you're reconciling that transaction by, say, marking that invoice as paid. So pretty straightforward. You are accepting payment on your website because you're linking off over to Stripe. Stripe is the one that has is handling all the credit card information. There's really nothing PCI compliance that you're worried about. It's a pretty simple solution to set up. Again, the big downside to this one is that the user's leaving your website. It's leaving your Power Pages site. And in an ideal world, that would be, it'd be nice if we could avoid that. So easy, straightforward, secure, but you're kind of leaving the Power Pages site. So, that's kind of the trade-off with this particular option. Okay, so let's talk about what I'm going to call the checkout experience, because to be honest, most of the providers, checkout seems to be the kind of the brand name that they're going with. So whether it's Stripe checkout or whether it's Moneris checkout, this seems to be the branding that a lot of the payment providers are using to kind of represent this particular solution. And so the different providers, again, have different ways that they accomplish this, but at a high level, what we're seeing now, this is kind of the most common flow, is that there's a way to basically embed certain details about your transaction. What you have to do is you have to generate a token, or you have to generate what they call a session, and that has to be done in server-side code. It can't be done in JavaScript, because in order to generate that session, you have secured API tokens that you need to deal with. So essentially, when the user is about to check out, you generate the session, and that session contains the details of what you want to pass over to your payment provider. Once you have that particular session ID, you can then take the user over to make the payment. Now, this is where some of the providers work a little bit different. I think with Stripe, you're redirected over to their site, whereas with Moneris, you can kind of they embed the credit card capture on their server. So there's a couple different ways that it happens. But the thing with this one is that at the end of the payment process, you still you get back to the page site, the Power Pages site. So you have to use server-side code to generate that session ID. In that session ID, you'd include things like, this is how much we're going to charge them, this is the invoice it's related to. And again, the transaction validation, similar to the webhooks, you can either use webhooks or server-side code to then update Dataverse and say, yes, this transaction went through. So it's somewhat of a similar experience to the first one, but it's a little bit more, it's a more cohesive experience, because generally in the end, you end up back on your Power Pages site. And again, depending on the provider, you might remain on that Power Pages site the whole time. But what makes this one a little bit more complicated is the fact that you do need that server-side code to generate the token. Now, this is where George was a huge help, because this is one he's implemented this solution before. The reason that this still kind of falls under the low-code bucket is that I think he said that the code to generate the token is like maybe 10 lines of code, and it's something that you can put in an Azure function. So with Azure Functions, you don't have to worry, you don't have to necessarily like get into Visual Studio and build a project and blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, copy and paste your 10 lines of code in here. It generates a token, it returns it. You don't have to worry about a whole bunch of authentication. Really what you're doing is you're using the server-side code to hide your API tokens that you don't want to make publicly available. So still involves writing some server-side code, but because it's pretty simple, a short amount of code that can go into an Azure function, we kind of categorize this as the low-code side of doing things. So again, depending on the provider, I know with Moneris, it's like directly on the page. I think with Stripe, they might do a redirect, but it's still a much more, like at the end of it, you get redirected back to your page, and it's still a bit more of a kind of a cohesive environment. So this is kind of like a nice middle ground. You don't want to do a whole bunch of development, but you want something more than just click a link and be taken off somewhere else. This is a nice kind of middle of the road solution. Okay, I'm just going to pause here for a second. We've got a question from Jim. Hey Jim, I know you're a frequent participant here, so appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for the question. It says anything you can say about payment integration with Product Catalog and Dynamic Sales would be helpful. For example, crafting the link session with info from product price tables, price list tables, etc. That's a great question. So yeah, essentially the anything to do with the like a catalog or shopping cart, unfortunately none of that exists right now. So we've done this type of thing before where we are integrating with these things, and really it comes down to in the past we would be using Liquid to be querying those and essentially generating shopping cart experiences like we have integrated with the product catalog before to actually create a true like store-like experience. But there really is nothing kind of like built into the product to do that. So it's essentially, kind of custom dev to whether it's with Liquid or whether it's the web API to pull that information down, pulling down the products and the price list and kind of calculating all those things, kind of client side. So I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but yeah, it's basically those are that data is in the database. You can query it with Liquid. You can kind of generate that experience, and then when we're talking about these solutions for actual payment integration, what we're talking about is at the end, if you figure out your total is $100, how are we going to charge that $100? But how you get to the point of, yeah, hey, this is going to be $100, often is either where we've kind of done the most payment integration is either, yes, it's a kind of more complex shopping cart experience, like what you're kind of talking about there, where you're kind of building out this front end web application, whether it's using React or jQuery or some other techniques to actually build out the front side experience. And at the end, you have your $100 they're going to pay for. The other place where we've used this quite a bit is with event registration. So sometimes it's a little easier. It's like, hey, this is my $15 event. I just need to charge that. And so that front end experience can be a lot simpler to develop. So, okay, so that's the kind of the low code option. Just going to move on here to what I consider to be the pro code option, something that a lot of the providers will refer to as hosted tokenization. So hosted tokenization. We've been using this technique for quite a while now. This is a technique this is kind of our go-to. It's just something we're familiar with. And in a lot of the projects we're working on, we do have access to that server-side code. So the way this works is that you can actually embed an iframe on the portal or on your site that generally just contains a few fields. And so that iframe will just contain, say, the credit card number, the expiration date, depending on your payment provider, maybe it's those 3 digits on the back of the card, that sort of thing. So, but it just contains the minimal information it needs in order to actually kind of create that credit card transaction. The rest of the details, whether it's the address, billing information, price, all the rest of that is kind of your responsibility. So you build out a form where, say, you ask for name, email, address, and then at the end of it, it's like, and plus we need your credit card information. So you put an iframe on the page. You can style that iframe so you can make it look to the user. It doesn't even look like it's an iframe. It's just like you have this long form with, say, 10 inputs on it. At the very bottom, there's 3 inputs that have to do with the credit card number. They fill in their credit card number and they click the submit button. When they click that submit button, what you actually do is you submit that iframe. So within that iframe, that iframe contains those fields that are within a form, and you submit that iframe. That form on the iframe posts back to the payment provider's service. So that credit card's going nowhere near any of your servers. They post back those credit card details to their server, and what it returns with is a unique token for charging that credit card. So you can then get that credit card, or you then have that token, and then you take that token plus all of the other data that was on your form. So, the name, the address, and all the other details that were on the form, plus that token, and then you can pass that token back to your web service, and then that token, which is not a credit card number, so it doesn't necessarily you don't have to worry about being afraid of that being in memory, because it's not the credit card number. It's just a token that you can then use to call their APIs to charge that card. And so there's a few different ways that you can actually architect this. If you're building out a companion app anyways, well, then it's not really much of a problem to create an endpoint where you pass in all this information, you pass in the name and the address, and here's the token, and then you call the payment provider's API to actually perform the transaction. The other way that we've done it before is if we don't have a companion app, is that you can actually do that sort of thing within a plugin within Dataverse. Again, that token doesn't fall within the scope of PCI compliance. At least that's my understanding. So that when you make when you can make the call to the API, you don't have that credit card number. So you can charge the credit card, but you don't actually know what the credit card number is. So what we've done in the past is we create a table in Dataverse. Sometimes it's called a payment transaction. And what you do is you can even use the web API within your portal to make a new, say, payment transaction record. One of the fields that you put on that payment transaction is that token. And then what you do is you create a plugin on that table that then calls out to the appropriate API to make the call. So whether that's, we've done that with Bambora, we've done that with Stripe. So the Stripe call or the Bambora call to the API, you can then make it with that token, and then you can have that. If you want to have kind of proper error messaging and stuff, you can make it so that if the payment fails, then you can even you can throw an invalid plugin execution exception that stops the transaction from being created, and you can kind of get the error messages back to the client to say, hey, actually that payment didn't go through. Again, this is pro code because it's not trivial to write the code within a plugin or with a companion app to actually call the API. It's not super complicated, but it's not, kind of the same 10 lines of code that it was to say generate that session. But what's nice about this is that the user probably doesn't even know that there's an iframe there. And it's basically a completely integrated experience within your Power Pages site. So it is a bit more code. It's not 10 times as much code, and we can, kind of once you, if you're a consultant and you're doing this for a number of clients, it's not that, once you get the first one, it's a pretty relatively small amount of code. So it's something to definitely consider if you're looking for a more kind of integrated, cohesive experience versus kind of linking off to another site. So those are kind of the three options we typically see. So to summarize, you can have just kind of a link on your site. You click that link, it takes you off to the payment provider's web page. You fill in the details over there, and that's kind of where the transaction ends. You then use webhooks or something like that to reconcile the transaction back into Dataverse. The second option is kind of the middle of the road, so it's kind of the low code where you are creating these sessions. You create these sessions kind of in advance, right before they're about to go check out. Using that session, you can then offer a kind of a more integrated experience where the user kind of ends up back on your site and it kind of looks and feels like a more cohesive thing depending on the provider. Sometimes it might be a link off to another site. Sometimes it might be embedded on the page. And so that's kind of the middle ground because the experience is nicer, but it still often feels like, it still doesn't feel like it's one. Because even when, so for example, I know with Moneris, it is still on the site. The way that it looks is it's still kind of a completely, you can brand it, but it still just doesn't feel like it's the same site. It still feels a little bit different. Whereas with the third option, the only thing that you're kind of taking from the outside world is just a few text inputs where the person's actually putting the credit cards, which can be styled so that it looks like any other inputs on the rest of your site. So with this third option, you are using the hosted tokenization, which is you submit that iframe returns you a token. You can then take that token, pass it back to your web service, your companion app, your plugin, and then you have that token and you can actually charge that card with the API without ever actually touching the credit card number. So those are kind of the three options. Again, we tend to do the third option just because it's the one that we're the most familiar with. It does seem to be most of the payment providers do offer that hosted tokenization mechanism. And since it's kind of an architecture that we've done many times, it's kind of easiest to kind of rinse and repeat on that one. But I know that, option number one is great if you don't want to write really any code. It's simple. You can get payment integration kind of on your portal very, very, very quickly. And then option number 2 is probably, it's a little bit, it's simpler, it's quicker, and kind of gives you the kind of the best of both worlds. So something to definitely consider as well. All right. I don't see any questions, but that does kind of cover kind of at a high level the techniques that I wanted to go through. I know we've got, just wanted to talk about our call, our next call. So our next call will be October 27th at kind of the same time here. As always, want to say thank you to Laura and the team at MS Dynamics World. And yeah, just wanted to open the floor to see if there were any questions from anyone else, whether they're related to our topic today about payment, or whether we, anything else about Power Pages. And yeah, again, if I mentioned this kind of last month, but if anyone's going to be at the Community Summit in Orlando in a few weeks, please come and say hi. I've got, I think, 6 sessions on portals, so please come and say hi. Otherwise, yeah, I'll just give it a few minutes here to see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask about Power Pages, Power Portals, or the Power Platform. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I think that we could probably wrap it up here for today.
Thanks, Nicholas. Thank you so much. We always appreciate having you here every month with us for this call. We did record today's event, so you can look for that to be sent to you as well. And we will see you next month. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.